Hi, this is James Fox, a member of Group C for the Software Tools class. I'm going to go over some of the stuff that as a group we learned, and I just wanted to cover basically what our project was so that you'll better understand what each of the group members did and what they learned. So our group consisted of Michael Snyder, Cameron Coventry, me, James Fox, and Jacob Butch. So both Michael and Cameron were largely in charge of the back end of our project, which included primarily the back end framework setup. Michael Snyder was very integral in dealing with the project organization, and Cameron did a lot of the game logic. Me, James Fox, and Jacob focused on the front end. Our roles varied depending on how we were progressing in the project, but I was primarily in charge of the game board itself, the map, and the prototyping and design of the map, whereas Jacob was more in charge of the design, the menu setup, and also worked on some of the back-end framework. So our project itself, we were making a Risk game, an interactive multiplayer online Risk game. I'll go over some of the details of the Risk game itself in a second. What we were using to make this on the front end was HTML, CSS, a little bit of JavaScript, and some React.js. All of this was put together with Node.js, and we also used Redux, Socket.io, and Express.js. So what the actual project was, by the end, we didn't have a chance to put the entire thing together, so we have a whole bunch of pieces to the bigger puzzle. The main idea was to have an interactive game that looked something like this, where you have a map that would have been able to you hover over, see everything that was going on, the who each territory belongs to, how many troops are in each territory. Then as each member goes on, it's a turn-based game, be able to click on the territory, which should auto-populate down here. You should be able to add your reinforcements, confirm, move on to the next phase, select which country you want to attack. Say you have Brazil, you'd want to attack West Africa. Click West Africa, populate here, confirm, go to the next one. Click where you want to attack. Then be able to roll the dice. We have the logic and everything that goes around this. You click roll until your battles are complete. Either you won or lost. You could obviously surrender. Once you do that, you can then go back, attack another country, or move on to the next phase, which is tactical, where you can move your troops over to the next country, and from there you can then end your turn and it moves on to the next person's turn, and you go on and on until one person controls the entire world. So that's our project. We were hoping to do this, and we put together most of the aspects that would have created this project, but weren't quite able to put it together before the deadline. So we're going to go through each of us and explain our parts and specifically what we learned while we were working on this project.
For our project, we chose to make a game of Risk online that you could play with 3 other people. I, as well as my teammates, learned that in order for a project to come together, it required a lot of communication, which is something that we lacked throughout the course of the project. Not to mention we were a little too ambitious when planning it. This ended up with us being just short of completing the project by the deadline. I myself had the main task of creating a main menu page for the website as seen here, and I have been able to take away a lot from this project despite it being incomplete. I learned how to properly use HTML to make a web page and just exactly what it takes to make a web page that has an organized layout and doesn't look completely terrible. I was able to work on a little bit of the game logic, so it was nice to learn some HTML as well as a little bit of JavaScript. Overall, I did gain valuable experience on what it is like to work on a group project in the computer science field. And now that I've gone through some trial and error there with this project, I know just what it takes to get the project done, which is something I won't be forgetting in the long run.
Well, good afternoon. This is James Fox. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at some of the things that I learned over this last month during this project. To give you an idea where I'm coming from is what I learned this last year in C++ is pretty much all of my programming experience. So as hopefully was described earlier, our project was about making the Risk game. So it required the front end, which was the map, the menus, all of those effects, and then actually what happened in the back end. I was primarily responsible for the front end. So the first thing I did was I started learning how to do HTML, CSS. Seems like the natural place to start. So as you can see here, I basically started just learning the concepts. The way I did that was through this w3schools.com tutorials. HTML, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in, basically just because it seemed mostly where the work was going to be was the CSS. So after learning the complete basics of HTML and how to make an HTML file, which I mean you can see here with the the basics, the head, and the body, and where all that content goes. I went through, made the basic content that I was looking for, and then went ahead and started working on the CSS. So what I learned with CSS was really everything. So where to put it, the syntax of it, for the most part, the inline CSS versus up above in the header, I suppose, which I did a little bit of both for this file, as you can see. So so I've got my classes, test class. So let me show you what this is here. This is basically what I did for my learning. And so from here, I've got a whole bunch of things. It's really just everything blurred into one page. The main things that I looked at were, adding images, adding objects, adjusting headers, font size, background color, background size, how things merge together, shapes. Some of the effects, like you can see here, this is a link and a hover over effect. Down here, we'll give you an idea of sort of what I was looking. The reason why I was going towards this was because I was hoping to make some sort of map for our Risk game from scratch. So this is kind of what I was originally going for. And I learned how to create these objects, use HTML to make the content, and then from there go ahead and use CSS to alter them. So here, the HTML, I made a table with the table rows and then the table data. So all that's HTML. And then from there, I gave them class names and IDs so that using inline styling, I could affect their size. And then going up to using the CSS, I could specify using both ID names as such, and also class names. So down these specific items, I gave them class names, but their class names were continents, which is different than later, which is why I hesitated. So as you can see, I had them, the backgrounds be a little bit different. The countries, I had a border, so an active here is when you hover over it. Well, hover over is hover over, and then once you click, it's a little bit different. So seeing that in effect, have all these hover over, that's in the class, not the ID specifically. With these two, I actually adjusted the IDs specifically because I was hoping to have, say, these left ones was one larger country. As you can see, Western United States. That changed later. but even so with CSS, and I learned how to do this. And from there, that's really when I was attempting to move on to make the map. I felt like I had learned enough to try to make something. And I'll give you an idea of what I was going for. So this is the prototyping, which is another, concept I learned. I did this all on paper, but I wanted to share it with the group. Even Google Drive is something I learned for this. I had never used it in my past experience. So this is the idea that I was going with. I wanted to share that with people. I both put the pictures of what I was trying to make. I was going to make this with CSS and HTML, of course, and I had a handful of ideas. I tried to make them on CSS, with CSS and HTML, and I'd done a couple things, and I can show you. See, like here was the hover, and then on click, I wanted to do different things. I was thinking of, instead of a specific map, having this type of, not just a grid, but like a hexagon grid. So here, this is the prototyping, and then more specifically, I could show you how I actually used HTML and CSS to make that. This was the basic. I wanted to actually use a grid as was used with, with a table with HTML. And so I tried to do it that way. However, it didn't really fit exactly what I wanted to do, but I did learn how to make a table, which is great, specifically in this context where I was able to use it to make more of a picture than like a content table, which is what I was going for with this project. But then afterwards, I tried to change that a little bit, and instead of using a table, I wanted to learn how to make it exactly how I wanted to, specifically how this prototype was with the hexagons. So I was able to do that by making rows. I made each and every hexagon be a class item, put them in a row, gave each of those rows a class, whether it was an even row or an odd row. I can show you sort of how that ended up. And so I think it worked pretty well. So I used offsetting tool in CSS so I could shift everything to the right and up a little bit. So it's still in a grid, just offset. And so I think that worked really well. This hover tool is sort of what I was going for, but also doesn't do anything in this context. It was really just a tool I was using so that you could see what was happening. See, I used different classes. Each of these items, they don't have a specific ID. They have a class. It's like a grid class. However, each of these larger territories, as used in Risk, have again, a separate class. So I could change those and link them together. And the greater continents are in their own class as well. So as you can see here, region square, that's the individual hexagon. North America would be obviously the entire continent, and then Alaska would be the territory specifically. So this would be region square in Alaska in North America. And I put them in that order so that, the broader context of CSS, the styling would be applied, but then every single time I wanted to be something more specific, as I narrowed it down to the smaller and smaller territory, that would take precedent with CSS. So after I made this map, this is really, I was pretty excited about this. However, when it came to how we were going to use the project, it didn't really fit in really well with how everybody else's parts and pieces were working together, which is another one of the components I learned. This is the part of the project where we all realized we were going our own direction. And it was great that we were going a direction, but it was not the same direction, which was always, that's always something interesting to learn when everybody's been working really hard and you realize that none of your stuff actually works together. So that was a blow to our group project. but it was something to learn, and so that was pretty important. So from here, we regrouped. We realized that we wanted to more centralize some of our features, and so the idea was to use Bootstrap as a way to make features more easily exchangeable between like this HTML document and some of the other React and Redux stuff that the backend group members were working on. So from here, we switched to a completely different map. That was the SVG map, and instead I shifted my focus to working on the phases in the user interface. So an example of that. So I showed you this first one, which was my prototype for the map itself, and then I also made a prototype for sort of the user interface. As you can see here, so this map is just non-interactive at the moment. It was just a placeholder. What I really focused on was this bottom part and having the ability for users to be able to click on the map, have that populate these fields down here, and then be able to say add reinforcements, confirm with this button, and then automatically shift to these other phases. And so we had 3 phases, each of which was sort of broken down a little bit. Again, each of which sort of had auto-populated fields from clicking on the map, and then having the user interface also interfaced with the other sites that we were using. React, JavaScript, Redux. So all of this was supposed to go together. I basically just worked on the front end so that there would be a button here to do something whenever something could be done. And so that's what I spent a lot of my time on, was figuring out how to make this in HTML and CSS and eventually JavaScript for some of the aspects. So let me show you the actual. So this is the Bootstrap map that I made, and so it includes up here, so where you can actually pull in the Bootstrap library, which is the CSS library, so that we can actually use some of these concepts, which are primarily in the class. So for instance here, class call1, this is a Bootstrap function here that separates, it's a built-in grid system essentially. So I've got rows and columns, rows and columns, rows and columns, columns and rows, rows and columns. And so that was a way to really make like an invisible grid and place things exactly where I wanted them to go in the size that I wanted them to go. So here's an example of how I put all of these as column 1. It's split up into 12 columns, and so this one I wanted to fill up all the rest of the space. So whereas these I put a very specific column number, this one just took up whatever space was left. And I wanted to do that for each of those. As the boxes changed, I wanted them to be able to adjust with whatever space was left. So here's an example of initially what I came up with, just as the whole, what the user would see. And so we've got these 4 different areas. We've got the map. We've got this action window, which would be completely separate. We've got this checklist that was supposed to be completely separate. And then this is the phase bar down here, which is what I was working on. And so just building this entire what the user could see, then built in with specifically what was happening down with the phases, is what I focused on for the second half of the project. And so as a more complete picture of what you could see is it turned into something like this. It's where we had all these boxes with the ability to either type in or click on the map with reinforcements. So, you could say Brazil, and then I want to add 3 reinforcements to that, or click these buttons to change that and confirm. We don't have any back-end functionality at this point, but what I was focusing on was the front end. Same thing with this ability to shift these phases. Once you would click this confirm, it should automatically fill this in or shift to these next phases. And so adding this, these are all Bootstrap. These are the Bootstrap buttons, which you can see in a lot of this. So even here, for instance. So we'll look at the first phase, phase 1, which on the map is this one, reinforcement phase. So we had several components. This is split up into a row with these, 1, 2, 3, 4 different rows, each of which with 2 to 4 columns, depending on what was in them. So seeing that in the code context, we've got this class row, which is the entire phase window. Inside that, we've got this whole phase 1, which is a column. Inside phase 1, then we have more columns and more rows and more columns. So the Bootstrap components were, like I said, the rows and the columns, plus these buttons. So like, for instance, this button, this badge primary, so that's going to be these things on each side. They're essentially buttons. Same thing with buttons, that they're down here, button, badge, primary. Badge primary just means it was green and had specific other CSS. There's other ones with like button alert, like this one. So it's just a different type of class that's pulled in from Bootstrap. And so just getting an idea of all of those different Bootstrap abilities and how to plug them in with CSS. Some of the formatting was a little bit different. So while they went into the same class feature that is CSS, they weren't exactly the same. So for instance, this says color white, which is exactly what it would be for CSS. However, some of the like alignment, instead of justify content center, it would be justify dash content dash center, and it wouldn't exactly fit in with the CSS component because it was Bootstrap enabled, and some of it took priority. And so a lot of that took a little bit of time to learn and get a better understanding for. So the next phase, as you can see here, so we've got all these phases, just the content and how it interacts with each other was the HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. As you can see here, when I click and things automatically changing into different CSS content. So that's actually the JavaScript that ended up learning for this. It's pretty basic, but again, coming from nothing, it still took me quite some time. So so this script here was the extent of the JavaScript that I learned for this. And I learned how to basically write a function in the way that I needed to. Most of the logic and context, or I suppose syntax, is very similar to C++, so that didn't seem so difficult. Items like, seeing how it's not super specific when it comes to variables. It's not very strict. And I can just put variable or let. These are a little bit combination from older tutorials and newer tutorials. It's where I would see variable and let. And the biggest thing was saying like getting element by ID and clicked ID and actually passing that in the function head and calling that from within each of these phases. So again, on click, I would call the expandable function and pass the argument, the ID of this specific div, or in this case, phase 3, which was P3 for this case. So, I'll walk you through pretty much what this function did. It basically says when you click on an item, scroll through every other phase, and if another phase is open, close it, and then open up the phase that you just clicked on. Now we used onClick really just for the idea of getting this function to work. When it came to the end of how we were going to use this, it was supposed to be just actions that were called from other actions, as an interactable game would be. So the onClick wasn't a permanent ID, but for right now, that's where we were at. So that really covers the extent of what I learned as far as the technical side of this game. I learned the HTML and CSS, and then went ahead with that knowledge, was able to get a better understanding of Bootstrap and how that worked, and how I could implement some of those ideas, specifically the columns and rows and buttons, just so that everybody else would be able to use those features more seamlessly. I know Jacob used those features in the title page as well, and then learning the JavaScript was also nice. I did do the similar to the tutorial that Jacob will talk about. I'm sorry, not Jacob. That Cameron will talk about, the tic-tac-toe React tutorial. I think we all did that so we could get an understanding of how React works. I did do that tutorial. I learned a little bit about that. We ended up changing, for instance, we learned how to switch all of the HTML that we had done into JSX so that we could use it with React. An example of that is, while I showed you my map.html, how we eventually ended up putting it in was separated. We did an external style sheet. We pulled out the head function so that it would just simply call the separate phase components. As you can see here, I think it goes into more detail later. But for instance, so the game board is really just the first part that calls each of the separate components. So it not only calls phasebar.js, but it also then calls in the index gameboard.js and the svg.css. So it's really just a smaller function that calls in all the external features that we were learning. And just to give you an example, so this is my initial, this one that I was going over now, that looks like this. And so what it looks like now is it's a .js file, and it's got, instead of some of the basic changes are, so for instance, instead of class, because class is a reserved word in JSX, we had to switch those to class name. We had to close some of the open tags. There were not a lot. I think so, for instance here, input was an open tag, so we just had to use this to close it. There wasn't a whole bunch that we needed to do to translate these to JSX, but that was an important part of actually being able to run it with the other components that, while for the most part were outside my realm of understanding, realizing that I needed to know enough to be able to translate my parts to be able to work with them was pretty important. So for the most part, that is what I learned during this project. And I will hand it off to somebody else to explain what they learned.
In order to have a better understanding of how to create our Risk game, we worked through a couple of tutorials, one of which was a tic-tac-toe game in React, which would alternate between X and O displayed on the board until a winner has been reached. And how this works is the board class inherits its properties from the handle state function, and it has two states: the square state, which renders the board, and the X is next, which decides whether X or O is going to be displayed on the board when the square is clicked. And this will run until a winner has been reached, which is shown right down here. And then it displays winner when that occurs. The main purpose of us working through this tutorial was to better understand how a hot seat implementation of a turn-based game would work. And how it works in this game is the ternary operator right here will alternate between displaying X and O on the board.
Part of my research in starting the Risk game was understanding React, JSX, ES6, and starting a project using Node.js as a backend. This project, which was a bulletin board, allowed me to do all of those things. For instance, in this React class called board, which extends the React component type, it starts with an initial constructor, which constructs these two notes, one call Lisa and the other email John. Throughout the function, there are some React functions that uses the JSX syntax. For instance, this div called board has a class of board. Instead of class, it's called class name. Understanding the few differences between HTML and JSX did provide some difficulties in the beginning, but after a while it flowed just like HTML. Additionally, this project showed me how to work with state. For instance, when clicking the edit button on call Lisa, you can change the state from call Lisa to test, and when saving it, it saves the state. While this is only a local change, it still demonstrates the fundamentals of how state is changed. Additionally, nested components, for instance, there's the note component, which is this small note, and there's the board component, which contains all of the notes, and understanding how each interact with each other, how the board triggers the notes save functions, how the notes are rendered, etc. This was very critical before starting the project to understand how everything is run and how to actually start the node server instance with npm. Starting npm and loading the function in the command prompt was done through Node, and it's through the localhost port 3000. During our initial project proposal, the Risk game was going to be a locally hosted multiplayer where clients can connect to a central server and each play from their own device. Because this was our initial assumption of the project, I did a second little test application, which was a chat window, a chat room that started with a constructed state of two messages, one from Tim and one from James. During this tutorial application, I learned a lot about Socket.io. I learned about Express and how Socket.io creates a bidirectional tunnel between the client and the server, whereas Express handles the HTTP requests like GET and POST. During this application, it was very helpful to understand the underlyings of Express, creating a HTTP server, and how, unlike in the bulletin board application, when a message is sent, it is actually saved, which is super helpful because it pushes it to the server, and the server requests the information. Instead of everything being on the client side and saved on the client, it is saved on the server. This could be ported over to our current React application in a means of having a server store all the states at the same time. And if we had more time, our Redux state would have been saved on every update or every 1 second after an update to keep the state the same. This was a very, very important and crucial tutorial, understanding the difference between client-side interactions with React and then server-side interactions with React, and displaying them on a static HTML client site. Midway through the project, after our midterm report, we decided to take a pivot with Risk and turn it into a turn-based game. And some inspiration we took was the Let's Play Tag turn-based game that we found on GitHub. This game used Redux to store the current state of all the players. It used Redux to store the current state of the game. It used Redux to store all of the states of all of the components in one centralized place and update them easily between components in React. Redux really saves on each individual component's functions and is a great place to decomplicate and reduce the amount of code needed between all the components to work together. So we decided to use that same extension with Redux. It introduced a few new components to learn. For instance, there are now actions. There's also containers instead of just components. Containers are smart components. Containers link to the store, and the store is one centralized location for every state of every component possible, which is really helpful because you don't have to worry about oh, did this component have a state of whose turn it is, and the other component has a state of whose how many lives there are. There's one store that you can just pull from users.lives, and it pulls the lives, or game.turn, and it pulls the turn, and that can be loaded into any component that is linked to the store, which is really nice, and keeps things simple, relatively simple after you learn the Redux lifestyle. Additionally, there are reducers. Reducers are the direct connections between the store and between the containers. For instance, in the game reducer, it has an initial state when the game is loaded for how many players there are, who is it in this tag game, which is the player whose turn it is, and the current move. Also, game over is false and based on actions, and the actions are up here. For the game actions that are triggered by the component, it says, oh, the game shouts next turn, the action outputs next turn, and the reducer hears next turn, and what does it do? It takes the current state, which is why there are 3 dots, and it returns whose turn to action whose turn. And the action sends that to the reducer, and the reducer returns this in the store. And the game reducer is called game, and so any component that loads game will now see that game dot whose turn is now updated, and it updates throughout every component recursively, which is really nice because we don't have to spend time updating the statuses of each player, which is okay because React automatically updates the DOM, the virtual DOM, based on the states, and Redux is a really handy way of organizing all those states into one place, and then React takes care of the rest, and that's a very common reason why React and Redux are used in parallel instead of other document object modifiers like jQuery, since React, the time complexities of updating these DOM objects in the game of tag is very quick and does not use a whole lot of resources. So this was the game that we used as inspiration. It was very helpful. It was very complicated at first, but after watching tutorials, we implemented these same types of actions, reducers, and containers in the final project. Here is our final presentation on our Risk game and what we have completed as of the final deliverable. Starting off first is our first feature, which is an onHover feature. The onHover feature works with the SVG map and returns the territory's name, it returns who the owner is, and it returns how many current troops occupy that territory. Now, this onHover feature uses a couple different actions. It uses the hover territory action, and the hover territory action is called by the container called risk map. Whenever the game loads, it adds a on mouse over listener to every single SVG object, and that listener calls out this hover territory function and passes the SVG maps ID, which is conveniently linked up to our store, and our store has special IDs for each territory with that same territory ID. So the hover territory takes in territory ID, returns the action territory hovered, and the reducer, called reducer hover, takes that territory hovered action, listens to it, and it returns the territory ID to the store. The store stores this territory ID as the hovered ID in the hovered territory. So now this variable is dynamically updated based on the onHover action that was triggered, and the container that displays this is the territory hover container, and it gets the ID based off of that newly set variable, and it returns as a prop the owner, the name, and the number of troops as seen here. We'll go ahead and demonstrate that first. So it tells you please hover on a territory for more information. We'll go down to South America, and when we hover over Brazil, it says it's owned by no one, there's no troops, and it dynamically pulls all of this data based off of that action for every single territory without having to manually code the ID for every single function. It simply adds an onHover event listener, passes the SVG ID dynamically, and then Redux and React handles the rest. The next feature, or the next action, is the updates territory actions. and that actually has a couple different actions within it. For instance, it has the update troops and the update owner action. Both of these actions interact with the reducer users. In the reducer users, it has it in an original state that's loaded when the React app loads. For each player has their own ID, a default name, a color associated with their ID. This might not be in the final version, which it doesn't super matter, but they do have an ID eventually, or a color eventually, their status to make sure they're ready, default owned territories, which is 0, and troops unassigned. The reason why they're unassigned is because during the random assignment state, it randomly assigns territory or troops to each territory, and it subtracts from 30, so everyone has an initial same starting troop amount. And during each phase, for example, the reinforcement phase, this gets dynamically updated based on how many territories that they would have. And that eventually is where we would take this project. However, we have not had sufficient time to implement that. So now we just have the initial states, and this is explaining what the purpose of this was for. So the update territory action works in conjunction with the reducer, the user reducer, and the reducer territory's current reducer to update the territories. Going first with the update troops, it uses the ES6 map function for an array, which returns every element in that array, and it tests to see if that past territory ID is equal to the territory ID that is in the element of the array of the map. So for example, if we hovered over Brazil and the ID was S-4, it would look for each territory ID sequentially, which is not super optimized, but it is the way that we initially implemented it, and returns the old state if it is not the same ID, and if it is the new ID, it returns the old state first, and then it updates the number of troops with the passed in old number of troops plus the action number of troops, which was passed from the initial action. Same as the update owner. The update owner uses the similar array map function and then updates the owner based off of what we saw in the user reducer, the owner ID. So it knows who owns that territory. These actions together can be viewed in the game function. If we go to the game container, we'll see that it loads the game board as the render, and then as soon as the component mounts, meaning as soon as the game is rendered, it goes ahead and runs the start game function. Now the start game function console logs starting game, and then it starts with the random troop assignment, which is the first step in any Risk game. During the random troop assignment, we only had time to randomly implement this for the first territory, in this case Alaska. It finds the territory ID based off of a similar ES6 function find, and then it checks to make sure that it is found. So if this is found, if the find function does not work, it returns null and it would skip this. And then it updates the owner first. So it updates the owner based off of the territory ID, which was passed based on the find, and then the whose turn it is. Once it updates the owner, we'll see if we hover over Alaska, the name is Alaska, owned by player 1, number of troops 0, versus Western USA, it's owned by no one. While we did implement the actions for troops, adding troops, and also changing the user's state, we did not have enough time to add that to this function, but after it adds the update owner, it would do the update troops. And when you hover over Alaska, there would be a randomly generated number between 0 and 5 troops added to Alaska, and player 1's troop count would be decremented based off of that same number. However, this proof of concept shows exactly our knowledge based off of how each the action, containers, and reducers work in conjunction with the store to update the state and display this properly and dynamically, all in a virtual DOM. Moving on to some of our more unimplemented and unfinished features was the loading screen. Based off of the game container, the game container actually switched between the instruction state and the game state. Similarly to the tag game, we took reference from that project and tried to apply it here. However, with a non-functioning loading screen, we just made the game state be the default state. But in this loading screen, you would enter each locally hot seat player's username, They would choose their color and click to ready up, and this would dynamically assign the state of the name to the user's reducer, the player's color to the user's reducer, and the status ready to the user's reducer. Another unimplemented feature, however, still visible in the React game is the action bar. And based off of this action bar, these are the different stages of risk. For example, the reinforcement stage, attack phase, and tactical move phase. Each of these lists would be updated with an X during the state that the current user is in. So reinforcement phase would be first. This is what the reinforcement stage looks like. For instance, if you owned North America, you could click on a country. There'd be a special function called onClick, and that action would target the onClick reducer, returning the territory's ID and allow you to dynamically populate this box, and you can assign reinforcements from here. Confirming it would push the changes from this text box to the state and update the territories and remove the territories to be assigned from the user's current reducer state in the store, which is very helpful and very easy to see conceptually how this would work. Then once all the reinforcements are done, React will do a test with how many reinforcements the user state has, and if there are none, it would move to 2-1, which is the attack phase. So you can choose any country, and it's really handy that when you hover over a country, the hovered territory information stays static, so you don't have to hover over, read, go to your attacking country, and then forget what you just saw. So this keeps everything really up to date, and all of this would be dynamically updated. So if you updated Western USA, the number of troops would increase on this view, since the virtual DOM is always updated in React without having any form of refresh. Select a country to attack, similar to how Risk attacks. We have a dice rolling mechanic that was in our source code. Next is the defending country. Both of these would be combined and go back interchanged. The final state, this is the view of the attacking number of dice moves and the defending number of dice moves. So all of these would automatically cycle. You wouldn't have to click on it. React would toggle these independently. And finally is the tactical move phase. So you select the first country, it will autofill. You select the second country, and then you can add your reinforcements. All of this uses that same onClick action that was described earlier, and that onClick action returns the territory ID, so it can be modified, the state can be modified. Once everything's done and the tactical move is confirmed, the action update user, or the game action called next user would fire, and it would increase the whose turn it is by 1 until it reaches 3, in which case it would cycle back to 0 to signify it is player 1's turn again, since this is a 4-player game. If we had more time, we would implement all of these phases, and our design team, front-end design team, did a great job visually representing this. However, with the learning curve, again, it took way too long to understand just how complex Redux and React are, learning the life cycle of Redux and how each of these states are modified along the way. I hope that this gives a good conceptual between our loading screen, the game screen, and then the interactions and future features that we would implement pending we had more time.